So I've just sketched out a little Jacobean motif that we're going to look at today and some experiment with some different filling stitches and some different outlining stitches and find ways to create really lovely and sumptuous texture in our embroidery work. I think the first technique we're going to look at is doing a laid stitch, which is really similar to a satin stitch, except your thread is primarily on top of your fabric, and there's very little carryover thread underneath your fabric. And it kind of really just saves you thread a little bit, and it puts a little bit less strain on your fabric overall. So we'll start with that, and then we'll work a trellis stitch over it, and I don't know, we'll see where we go from there. All right, to get started with our laid stitch, we are going to bring our needle up anywhere, preferably at the widest part of our design, and also somewhere in the middle. And we're going to bring that straight across in the direction we want it to go and take a stitch into the opposite side of our fabric. Now I'm going to work with this stitch with 4 strands of thread. I rarely work with so much thread at a time. 2 strands is usually my maximum. But on something like this, we're going to fill this laid stitch over with a trellis stitch when we're done anyway. So it's really not that delicate. We're going to hide a multitude of bulkiness by doing this. Really, it is the background painting. So the hallmark of a laid stitch is that we are not traveling underneath the fabric more than a little fiber or 2. So really, every time we take this stitch and this filling stitch, we are stitching up the fabric, across the design, down into the fabric, and then back up on the same side so that we're not carrying any thread underneath. It saves a lot of thread. I like this better than a satin stitch because it is more sustainable. It just wastes less product that no one's ever going to see. Now, of course, if your piece is going to be viewable from both sides of the hoop, then a traditional satin stitch might be better for you. You could also work a split stitch or a back stitch around your entire shape before you start doing your laid stitch if you want there to be, you know, a nice little raised edge, or you could pad this like you pad a satin stitch. You certainly can do all of those things to give a little bit more high impact. For our purposes, we're not going to, again, because we're going to cover this up with a trellis stitch. So it isn't going to matter. And we're also probably going to work a nice little chain stitch around this when we're done, or before we do the trellis stitch as well, just to clean up the edges in a really nice way. Because I'm not super concerned or being super careful right now with where I'm sewing along my outline. It really is just about filling in the bulk of the shape. Of course, you can take your time with this and fill in your outline really, really neatly and cleanly and really get that edge perfect and beautiful, but that's not what this is about today. So that's not what I'm gonna do. Okay, now that I've done my laid stitch, I've marked out a little 1/4 inch lines, grid lines for myself, so that I can do my trellis stitch on top of it. And the trellis stitch is quite simple. It's just big, long grid lines that will overlap each other at some point. So I'm gonna just sew in between my markings so that I can get nice horizontal lines spanning the entire distance of my shape. Not too exciting. I was a little careful placing these so that I wouldn't run into any difficulties with my shape here. It's not required, but it certainly makes it easier so that you don't have to keep starting and stopping, and it keeps the flow of your trellis stitch quite nice. You'll also notice that I did my best to lay my trellis stitch in a direction that would not contradict or get lost in the direction of my laid stitch. So my trellis stitch is going to go this way and this way, keeping my laid stitch at a 45-degree angle so that I don't have to fight it. So now all I need to do is go through and sew a little stitch or knot or something on top of every one of these little connection points to finish this off. Usually you'll see this in a contrast or a different shade of the thread. So I think I'll do mine in green because that'll be fun. This is like a detail surface stitch in its most true sense. It adds a little bit of interest, it adds a little bit of depth, it's fun, it's exciting, but it's just a wee little stitch, just a wee little point. And you can get quite decorative here if you want to. I mean, you could, do some big fun knots, you could do colonial knots, you could do the raised chain band stitch as a surface stitch on these little bits. I think I'll just take a little X on going in both directions instead and really pull that down in. I'm gonna sew these starting in the middle and working my way out because it's always better to start in your middle and work your way out. And for the trellis stitch and for these little guys, I'm sewing them all with a 2-ply thread. Because again, unless I'm doing something like the laid stitch before, I find anything more than 2 threads to be really cumbersome and bulky, and chunky and just not my aesthetic. So I am going back to my 2 threads now that I'm working on something more delicate that, has impact. And I think it'll turn out really quite lovely. And there we have it, a trellis stitch over a laid stitch. You'll notice that as I did mine, they're a little closer together here and they get a little bit wider over here, and that creates a little bit of a shading effect since my red is darker than my orange and the concentrated green is close together. It's almost as if it's darker over here and then rounding as it gets over to the other side where the light's hitting the flower. A lovely way to use our trellis and our laid stitch in combination. This is everything I'm stitching right now is in DMC cotton floss, which is not standard for a Jacobean motif like this. That's usually crewel work, meaning you're using a wool fiber to sew it. But I like the sheen of this, and it really is quite luscious. The sheen you get from the cotton and the individual strands of fiber that you really get definition from really just makes the whole thing feel more luxurious. But that's about it for the body of this. In the next video, we'll look at filling our cap, and then we'll go through and define some of this with an outline.